Good morning. Are you glad you're here? You could be anywhere you wanted to be today, couldn't you? I'm glad to be here too. It's good to see you here. Our lesson today is, well, it's kind of negative, but I guess you can make anything out of whatever you want, can't you? Everything depends on our outlook, doesn't it? Our attitude. But the lesson today, I have titled Complaining. I forgot what the lesson writers called it, something about murmuring of Israel, complaining. And you know, I was pretty well familiar with these verses in the Bible, but after studying recently, I just feel plumb ashamed because of my complaining. I've decided I'm going to quit complaining. How long do you think that'll last? Well, nobody likes a complainer, right? Nobody likes to hear somebody's complaining. But Israel, well, I guess, was the world's worst at complaining. You know, God brought them out of Egypt with a high hand. I'm not sure what that means, but He brought those plagues on the people. Everybody was either involved in that or observed that. He brought them out, and they hadn't gone a day's journey till they started complaining. They called Egypt the furnace. It was a hard place to live. They brought them out after the 10 plagues, and before they got to the Red Sea, they were already complaining because they saw the dust cloud behind them, which meant Egypt was in hot pursuit. I guess they wondered if they were going to have to swim the river, the Red Sea. But anyway, they complained the first day, and they continued to complain. I think it took them about 3 months to get to Mount Sinai, or the wilderness of Sinai. So many times during that short period of time, they're complaining. So I want to read from chapter 11 of the book of Numbers this morning, starting in verse 1. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it. Is that new? Is that something you never thought of before? The Lord heard it. I can complain in my own mind and my wife not hear it. And God knows. She does too most of the time. But anyway, the people complained. It displeased the Lord. Do you remember growing up? Do you remember how your mother did not like to hear you complain? I used to hear the saying, well, you'd complain if they hung you with a new rope. Yeah, I guess so. But we have a choice. We can complain, or we can do what we can about it and turn the rest of it over to the Lord, right? We can complain, or we can be content. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it. And his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burnt among them and consumed them that were in the uttermost part of the camp. I don't know whether this was a lightning strike, a brush fire, or just what it was, but the Lord sent it as a matter of judgment for those complainers. That's pretty harsh, isn't it? I used to get a whipping every time I turned around, seemed like growing up, but I never was consumed by fire. That's terrible judgment, isn't it? God brought judgment on them. Verse 2, and the people cried unto Moses, and when Moses prayed unto the Lord, the fire was quenched. Boy, that's simple and to the point, isn't it? When Moses prayed for them, God quenched the fire. And he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. Now verse 4, and the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting. The mixed multitude. Well, we think about Israel being delivered from Egypt, bondage in Egypt. Well, there were some others who kind of tagged along with them. Some of these were half-breeds, but they considered them all foreigners because they were not circumcised Hebrews. So they were not among God's chosen people. They were there with them, but they were not part of them. I guess they had seen the miracles that God had performed in those plagues in Egypt. They knew a little about God, but not much. But they came along, and they were a bad influence on the children of Jacob. What kind of influence are your friends? All my friends have a good influence on me. I just wish my influence on them could be as good. I remember growing up hearing, well, I still use the phrase myself sometimes, especially when I see a young lady here who has a boyfriend I haven't met. And I'll say, did your mom ever tell you to be careful of the company you keep? Well, that's pretty important. And we can go to work somewhere, and it may be that we don't have any choice about those people we work with, whether we work closely with them or not. But we can choose our friends, can't we? We need to be careful of the company we keep. The children of Israel were keeping company with these people, and their bad attitude rubbed off on them. Does the world rub off on God's people? Have we allowed the world to affect our godly life? And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a-lusting, and the children of Israel also wept again and said, who shall give us flesh to eat? Now they had been given flesh to eat before, but I don't know whether that was a short period of time or what. But anyway, they remembered all the good things they thought they had to eat when they were in Egypt. Why didn't they remember the taskmasters, the whip, and the sweat, and the undesirable working conditions they were in all this time? They didn't seem to remember that. All they remembered was the good food they had. I think it's notable that when they left Egypt, they left 430 years to the day after they had come down there. Jacob and his family came down. 430 years to the day they left Egypt. And they began to complain all the way to the promised land. But we remember verse 5, the fish which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before their eyes. This manna was, to me, it's an amazing food. I don't know, but I picture it falling like fine flour, bleached. And when they gathered it up, and they made, I figure they had pancakes for breakfast. I figure they made some delicious cookies out of that manna. But I guess they got tired of it. Do you get tired of eating the same thing every day? I eat the same breakfast that I ate 75 years ago, and I like it. We're creatures of habit, aren't we? We hate to deviate. They were tired of the manna because that's all they had, and I can kind of understand that, but it was given by God's grace, free gift of His grace. He provided it, and nobody else could provide it, so they had plenty of it. They had to use wisdom in how they used it, so they complained about not having meat to eat. So then we see Moses complaining. It's hard to imagine Moses complaining. What's your opinion of Moses? What kind of a fellow was Moses? Well, in chapter 12 it says that he was the meekest man on earth. That is quite a commendation. Meek means, or carries with it the idea of humility, mildness, gentleness, not easily provoked. The kind of people you like to be around are meek. Well, Moses, in chapter 11, verse 10, it says, and Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses also was displeased, and Moses said unto the Lord, Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? Now he's talking about himself. He's getting self-centered, isn't he? He's concerned with his personal well-being. Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant, and wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? He knew what he was getting into, didn't he? Or did he? Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them, that they should say unto me, carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father beareth a sucking child into the land which thou swarest to their fathers? Whence should I have flesh to give unto all the people? For they weep unto me, saying, give us flesh to eat, that we may eat. I am not able to bear this people alone, because it is too heavy for me. Now look at verse 15. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. He was pretty highly excited, wasn't he? He was terribly upset. But he seems that I see some selfishness in this. He's more concerned about himself than he is the Israelites. And they were his responsibility to a great degree to bring them out. But he says it's too much for me to deal with. And I find it amazing. And he said, Lord, if this is what I got to do, just kill me. Just take me out. That's pretty drastic, isn't it? Well, Moses, like I said, was the meekest man of all the earth in his day, so he would probably be about the best example that one could come up with. But we see his humanity, don't we? We see he's just a man. So God gives him some helpers. They select 70 people out of the responsible people of integrity, to help him guide and direct the people of Israel. And then they talk about this quail. Verse 18. God says, and say thou unto the people, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, for ye shall eat flesh. Now that's what they were crying for, flesh. They have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and ye shall eat. Now listen to this. Ye shall not eat nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, until it come out your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why came we forth out of Egypt? Boy. I remember my aunt. She was the sweetest lady. She loved children. I don't remember which one aunt it was. I had 2 or 3, but when the little kids were around and they're begging for candy, and one of the mothers, one of my aunts, gave them some candy and said, eat that candy. Just eat it till your tongue logs out. I think that's what God's saying here, isn't it? I'm going to give you quail till you get sick of quail. And they did. We need to be careful what we ask for. You ever ask God for something and he gives it to you, and then you say, what have I done? I believe sometimes God gives us things that he knows we don't need because we ask for. We need to be real careful about that. Now in Moses complains to God about him being unable to provide meat. And in verse 23, the Lord replies to Moses, and he says, is the Lord's hand waxed short? We need to keep in mind there's nothing that God can't do. So in chapter 11, verse 31, we read about all this. And there went forth a wind from the Lord, and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as they were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. Now, what I understand this to mean is this was not uncommon to have quail coming through this area at this particular time. And the wind would blow them off course and all that. And I understand the wind probably blew them down, would not let them rise. So they flew off about 3 feet above the ground, just right for batting practice, just right. I don't know if they used bats or pallet wood or what, but they came and made it was real convenient for them. Look at verse 32. And the people stood up all that day and all that night and all the next day, 2 days and all night, gathering quail. Gathered the quails. He that gathered least gathered 10 omers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp. I think this is a reference to spreading them out in the sun to dry the meat. Have you ever dried apples on the roof? Yeah, I have. But what's interesting to me here is that the ones who gathered least gathered 10 omers. Now, I know that my figuring is not totally correct. There are different figures you come up with when you read from different students of the Bible, but my calculations indicated that it was 17 and a half bushels. Now, when I grew up in the country, I'd go from, different people who had a farm or a little place, and I never saw 17 bushel baskets. Everybody had a bushel basket, a few, but not 17. I don't know what they gathered this quail in, perhaps sacks or I don't know, but that's a lot of quail, isn't it? Well, they got what they asked for. And look at verse 33. And while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against them, and the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. Now, he didn't smite all the people, but he smote the people who complained, who clamored for quail, for meat. And they called the name of that place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people that lusted. In chapter 12, we have a situation that is caused by jealousy. You remember Miriam, Moses' sister, who went down by the cattails, what do they call them? Bulrushes. And when the king's daughter came down and discovered Moses and decided to take him home, she was there. She was there to intercede for Moses and was able to provide Moses' own mother to be his nurse in the palace of the king for a period of time. I think it was until he was weaned. Well, that was a great blessing, wasn't it? His basic teaching was right. So, but Miriam becomes jealous. She and Aaron says, the Lord speaks through us as well as you. Why do you get all the glory? Yeah, he got the glory, didn't he? He had it pretty rough. But anyway, you know the story how that God struck her with leprosy, and so they would not let her in the camp for 7 days, which is, I guess, a period of cleansing. And you know what that did? How many people are on this march, this journey? 600,000 footmen. You get different ideas from different people. Some say 2 million, 2.5 million. I say there's probably 3 million. That's a lot of people. I can't even visualize that many people in my mind, even on a 1,000-acre desert. I just can't picture that. But there was it held up these people. For 7 days they stood there and did not move. Well, God takes care of that. Aaron repented, and it's interesting to me here that verse 13, Aaron says, Moses, don't let her be as one dead. And Moses, verse 13 says, Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, heal her now, O God, I beseech thee. He didn't mince any words, did he? This is bold. He said, God, heal her now. And he did. Well, I think we need to be careful how we address God. But do you talk to God all the day? Do you ever get into tight and say, Lord, help? That happens to me a lot, especially when I'm doing something. Lord, help. But God answers. God does answer prayer. Now we have chapter 13 where, let's read the first couple of verses there. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, send thou men that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall ye send a man, every one a ruler among them. Now, there's several places in the Scriptures that speak of sending out these spies to search out the land. But I get the impression, that I can't give you the Scripture and verse, I've been over it recently, but I forgot where it was. It seems to me that the idea of sending out these spies was the idea of the people of Israel. Not necessarily God's idea, but as it reads here, it sounds like God sent them, and he did. But why would they need to go look at the land? God said it's a land flowing with milk and honey, and what else did he say? He'd already told them in Exodus chapter 23, verse 27, he said, I will send fear before thee, and will destroy all the people to whom thou shalt come. And I will make all thine enemies turn their backs to thee. And I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate, and the beast of the field multiply against thee. By little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. Now look at verse 31. This doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about this morning particularly, but, and I will set thy bounds from the Red Sea even to the sea of the Philistines, and from the desert unto the river, for I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and thou shalt drive them out before thee. He's giving the bounds of their habitation. You know, they're going into the promised land. They call it the land of Canaan. But if I understand this, and I don't know whether I'm right or not, but I get the impression that what he's giving them is that land on from the Mediterranean Sea on the east all the way to the Tigris and Euphrates on the west. That whole area, Arabia, I guess is what it's called today. But they have never inhabited all that. They have never claimed it. I think someday they will, but that may be in the kingdom, in the millennial reign. I don't know. So God had promised them. They didn't have anything to worry about. By the way, it said, I'll send hornets before you. You ever had a hornet after you? You ever had a bumblebee get after you? Boy, I have. I want to tell you a little story. I don't remember when this was, but it was a long time ago. And, my wife and I have 4 boys, 2 sets. And I don't know which set it was, but I took them 2 boys over to Bobby Radford's one day. He was building the shop so he could work on cars. He'd already built it, but he needed to put a roof on it, so we decided we'd help him put a roof on it. And I went up there with those boys, and they were big old boys. They could take care of themselves. But I was down on the ground, and it was about 11 o'clock, and a wasp or bee or something got after one of them boys. Scared me to death. I thought he was going to run off that roof. And I ate him out pretty good. After lunch, I went up there and did the same thing to me. You just can't stand in front of a bee. I've run for a quarter of a mile to get away from a bee, and all the time he's right there in my hair. But God knows how to make people run, doesn't he? He said, I'll send that hornet. They had the promises that God would provide for them, would take care of them, would take care of these enemies of theirs. And remember, he told them to destroy these people. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why would you kill somebody? This was God's judgment on them for them being so ungodly, for turning away from God. It was his judgment on the Canaanites. All right, they sent these men, and these men, it says all rulers among them. They were men of integrity, responsibility, that the public looked up to them, respected them as such. So they weren't riffraff. They were people of integrity, and they sent them out there to look. They're gone 40 days. 40 days. Someone said it was a 300-mile trip. How long has it been since you walked through the woods? Well, that's too long. 300 miles is a long ways to go. 40 days is not necessarily, it just seems like a short time to me to go 300 miles. And I figure they probably split up when they left, those 12 men, so they could get a better idea of different areas of the country. So they go spy out the land, and they come back and they say, verse 21 of chapter 13, so they went up and searched the land from the wilderness of Zin unto Rehob, as men come to Hamath. And they ascended by the south and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the children of Anak, were. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. And they came unto the brook Eshcol, and cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes, and they bare it between two upon a staff, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. They had, I remember when I was a little boy seeing a picture in the Bible, somebody's Bible, of these two men carrying a cluster of grapes on a pole on their shoulders between them. Can you imagine a cluster of grapes like that? It's hard for me to imagine. But it just shows the evidence of what God said, a land flowing with milk and honey, which indicates the most fertile, productive property just about anywhere. Now they return and they give a report. 12 men come to give a report on what they have seen. They tell them, of course, that it's a good land, it's flowing with milk and honey. Verse 28 says, nevertheless, what does that mean? It means, on the other hand, or in spite of this, nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. Well, verse 29 that's what they were sent for, to determine where the people were located and things like that. But the rest of their report was not good. Well, look at verse 30. Caleb. And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. Here is the difference of a man with faith in God and men with faith in men. Peter and John replied to their government leaders when they arrested them for preaching Christ. He said, we ought to obey God rather than men. You and I ought to obey God rather than men. It is without faith, it is impossible to please God. And these old former slaves seemed like they had so little faith. After all they had seen, how much faith does it take when you have experienced God's answered prayer, answering your prayers? Have you ever turned something over to the Lord and just say, Lord, take care of this, and then in your mind you didn't care how he worked it out? That's the way you got to be. If you turn it over to it, you got to let him have it. Have you done that and then seen how he worked it out? Well, if you have, next time it's not so hard to do, is it? These people had seen all kinds of evidence of God's providing, yet they were not content, and they just did not believe after seeing it. You know, if they saw Pharaoh's army drowned in the Red Sea, and the next morning they stood around and they saw the dead bodies washing up on the shore and all that, isn't that a pretty good object lesson that God provides? They didn't learn. 1 Corinthians, there's some verses in 1 Corinthians that relate to this. 1 Corinthians 10:11 says, "Now all these things happened to them," and Paul had been talking about what happened to Israel during that 40 years wandering in the wilderness. He said, all these things happened unto them for ensamples. Ensample is a pattern to learn from. For ensamples, and they are written for our admonition, our instruction, for our learning. And verse 6 of that same chapter says, "Now these things were our examples, to the intent we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted." I read something one time. It said, learn from the mistakes of others because you won't live long enough to experience them, to make them all yourself. Well, that's good advice. If we don't learn from them, then their experience is sort of wasted on them, isn't it? Experience is the best teacher, but it is the hardest, and it causes more pain than any other way. So we would do well to take note of this and learn from it and quit complaining. Like I said, I'm kind of ashamed of myself this morning after studying this because of my complaining. Do I really have anything to complain about? God is so good. He died for me, and I wasn't worth it. I'm still not. But he died for me anyway. So I really don't have anything to complain about. Caleb sets a real good example in chapter 13 there. Let us go up at once and possess it. Then again in chapter 14, and all the congregation lifted up their voice after the evil report from the 10 spies, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron, and the whole congregation said unto them, Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in this wilderness. When they got to the Red Sea, before they got there, had been on the road one day, they said, Would God we had died in Egypt. And that's what they had cried about, was getting out from under those taskmasters. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? Well, again, in chapter 8, verse 8, chapter 14. Let's begin reading verse 5. The people cried, complained. They said they cried, wept in their tent door, which indicates this complaining and weeping was done in public, in the open. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces. Moses and Aaron, the two great leaders of all this 3 million people, fell on their faces. What does that mean? I think it showed humility and great concern, perhaps worship God, and I'm sure they probably went to the Lord on behalf of these people. And Joshua, verse 6, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, which were of them that searched out the land, rent their clothes. I don't like to rend my clothes. Do you? Even when they wear out, it pains me to tear them up and make rags out of them, but I can use the rags. But their shirts, their garments cost a lot more trouble, perhaps money, than ours do in comparison. But they tore their clothes. What did they do that for? They were highly agitated. They were really upset and mostly disappointed. And it shows their disappointment when they do that. Now they say, verse 7, and they spake unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through is to search it, is an exceeding good land. Exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it us. A land which floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. These two had the right attitude. In Deuteronomy, which is kind of repeating or reminding themselves of what had gone on, Deuteronomy 1:29 says, then I said unto you, this is Moses, dread not, neither be afraid. The Lord your God, which goeth before you, he shall fight for you according to all that he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. He said, the 10 plagues you saw from God in Egypt should give you enough evidence to know that God will take care of you. Well, God said, I'm going to destroy this people, Moses, and I'll make a great nation out of you. What an offer would that be? But Moses knew better than to do that, and he prayed, interceded for Israel. God wanted to wipe them out as one man. And Moses interceded for him. He said, okay, I'm not going to do that, but they will, those that complained will die in the wilderness before they get to the promised land. They wandered around for 40 years, and those people 20 years old and upward never got to see the promised land. Not even Moses. But Joshua and Caleb did. They were in their 80s when they drove out the people before them and claimed their portion of that promised land. Well, Deuteronomy 32:10 says, speaking of Israel and God, he led them about, he instructed them, he kept them as the apple of his eye. Zechariah 2:8 says, he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. The apple of his eye is most cherished. God's people are most cherished by God. I want to turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 6. Now I'm talking to myself just like I'm talking to you, but this word of God tells us in 1 Timothy 6:6, but godliness with contentment is great gain. Contentment. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. You know, Paul understood that. He said, I've learned how to deal with life when I'm full and when I'm hungry. He said, I've learned in whatever state I am, therewith to be content. Why can't you and I be content with such things as God gives us? Well, maybe that's something we can work on. Maybe that's something the Lord will help us to work on. All right, I'll shut up now. Thank you for your time this morning. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Let's remember those who need our prayers today, and you know them as well as I do. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for being so good to us. We thank you for your power and your wisdom and for your mercy and your grace. Thank you for Jesus who died in our place on Calvary to pay the penalty for all our sin. May we always be grateful for that, and may we bear that in mind in everything that we do. Keep in mind that we are an object of God's grace and what Jesus went through and all his suffering and death to pay for our salvation. May we consider this. May we see that since he died for us, he asked us to live for him. May we be willing to live for him or die if it's his will. We ask you to be with those people that on our prayer list and others that need our prayers who are suffering. We ask for the grace of God to be provided to sustain them in every difficulty. We pray you'd work out those problems in the way that's best according to your wisdom and mercy. Help us to be a blessing to one another. And we ask your blessings on the rest of this service today, that your word may accomplish your purpose everywhere it goes. We ask for forgiveness of sin in the name of Jesus. Amen.